Ever feel like the economy is this giant, confusing machine and like you're just trying to figure out which buttons to push?
Yeah.
Well, we're diving deep into India's economy, specifically focusing on prices and inflation.
Okay.
We're going to be decoding the 2023-2024 Economic Survey of India and figuring out how it all impacts you.
That's a great way to put it. I think, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, but it really is
Ah,
about understanding those forces that shape our daily lives.
absolutely. And, the first thing that struck me was how well India has done despite all the global craziness.
Hmm.
I mean, they kept retail inflation at its lowest level since the pandemic at 5.4% in fiscal year 2024.
Wow.
That's with the pandemic hangover and the Russia-Ukraine war still happening.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And the report highlights that this wasn't just a fluke.
Yeah.
It points to a combination of strategic actions by the Reserve Bank of India and some very targeted government interventions.
Yeah, they seem to be on the same page.
They do. It seems like a well-coordinated dance between monetary policy and government action.
Yeah, and they didn't just keep inflation in check. They outperformed a lot of other countries.
Yeah.
Their inflation was lower than both the world average and the average for emerging markets and developing economies.
Absolutely. That's a significant achievement and positions India quite favorably in the global economic landscape.
For sure.
While many countries were really struggling to contain inflation in 2023, India managed to stay within that target range of 2–6%.
Yeah, it really begs the question.
Yeah.
What were they doing differently?
Yeah. What were they doing differently? Well, the report digs into that. And, one thing that really stood out to me is that inflation isn't just one big blob.
Right.
They break it down into different types, which I think is really crucial to understanding all the nuances.
Absolutely.
So we often hear about headline inflation, right?
Yeah.
That gives us the overall picture of price changes.
Mm.
But it's equally important to consider core inflation,
Okay.
which filters out those volatile food and energy prices to reveal the deeper underlying trends.
So it's like looking past the surface and seeing what's going on underneath.
It's like looking beyond those surface ripples to see the deeper currents at play.
I like that. And speaking of volatility, the report dives deep into food inflation.
Yes.
Which is a huge deal in India. I mean, remember the tomato price spike last summer?
Absolutely.
Ooh, people were feeling the pinch.
Absolutely. And it highlights how sensitive food prices are,
Yeah.
especially for those staple foods,
Right.
to both global trends and domestic conditions.
Mm.
The report attributes some of those price fluctuations to global factors, but they really emphasize the impact of those adverse weather conditions within India itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Droughts, erratic rainfall patterns can really disrupt agricultural production,
For sure.
driving up prices for essential items like vegetables and pulses.
So we're seeing this interplay of global pressures and those local challenges,
Yeah.
particularly in the agricultural sector.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But what really surprised me was that the report mentioned that core services inflation hasn't been as much of a problem in India as in some advanced economies.
Mm.
Why is that? What are they doing differently?
Well, it seems to be a combination of factors. The RBI's monetary policy, including increasing that repo rate to control overall inflation, definitely played a role. But then the government stepped in with some pretty targeted measures to directly address those price pressures,
Okay.
especially for essential items.
What did those measures actually look like?
Okay, well, first they implemented price cuts for essential items,
Okay.
including reducing the price of LPG cylinders, which is a major expense for a lot of households.
For sure.
They also introduced a subsidized wheat flour called Harat Atta to make it more affordable for a larger segment of the population.
So directly easing the burden on consumers,
Yeah.
especially those who are most vulnerable to price hikes. But what about those who might try to exploit the situation?
Right.
Did they do anything to prevent hoarding and price manipulation?
Oh, absolutely. They imposed stock limits on commodities like wheat to prevent exactly that
Okay.
hoarding and that artificial price inflation.
Right.
And then on the flip side, they also reduced import duties on certain edible oils to increase the supply and moderate prices.
So it sounds like they were trying to cover all the bases.
Yeah.
So they had the monetary policy from the RBI,
Yeah.
the targeted price cuts and stock limits, and then they also extended the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with that program.
Right. It's a massive social safety net that provides free food grains to a huge number of beneficiaries, over 81 crore to be precise.
Wow.
This extension was really crucial for shielding those vulnerable populations from the worst effects of those rising food prices.
Wow, that's a significant program, especially in a country as vast and diverse as India.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this combination of strategic intervention and safety net measures to address those immediate challenges of inflation.
Yes.
But the report also delves into the regional variations in inflation across the country, right?
Exactly. It's easy to think about inflation as a national phenomenon,
Right.
but the reality is that different parts of the country experience it differently,
Of course.
with varying levels of intensity and impact.
Yeah.
And that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah. The report shows that in fiscal year 2024, most states and union territories actually saw a decrease in inflation.
Okay.
This mirrors that overall decline in India's average retail inflation that we were talking about.
So it sounds like things are moving in the right direction across the board.
Generally, yes. But there's this fascinating rural-urban divide
Okay.
that emerges when you look a little closer.
Interesting.
You see, rural areas often have a higher proportion of food items in their consumption basket compared to urban areas.
That makes sense. Food is probably a bigger chunk of a rural household's budget, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in states where food prices were higher, rural inflation tended to be more pronounced.
Okay.
The reports even points out that this variation in inflation rates between states, it's more noticeable in rural areas than urban areas. So even though the overall picture is improving, there are these pockets of the country,
Yeah.
particularly in rural communities, where the pressure is still being felt.
Yeah, and the report gives a really striking example of this with Haryana and Goa.
Okay.
Haryana had significantly higher overall inflation and a much wider gap between that rural and urban inflation
Wow.
compared to Goa, which had relatively lower inflation across the board.
It really underscores the importance of looking beyond those national averages, right?
Yeah,
And recognizing how these trends play out differently at the local level.
absolutely.
So we've got this complex interplay of global factors, domestic policies, and these regional variations. What about the future? What's the outlook for India's inflation in the coming years?
Well, both the Reserve Bank of India and the International Monetary Fund project that India's inflation will continue to moderate and move towards its target range.
That's good.
The RBI expects headline inflation to be 4.5% in fiscal year 2025
Okay.
and 4.1% in fiscal year 2026.
So it sounds like they're not expecting inflation to just vanish overnight.
Right.
But there's a sense of cautious optimism there.
Yeah, rightfully so.
Yeah.
While that short-term outlook appears positive, India still faces some long-term challenges when it comes to maintaining price stability.
Okay, like what?
One of the key issues highlighted in the report is India's dependence on imported edible oils.
Ah, yes. Edible oils, it seems like every time I go to the grocery store, the prices are going up.
Yeah, it's a real concern. Domestic consumption of edible oils has been growing faster than production, making India increasingly reliant on imports.
And as we saw with those global price fluctuations, that vulnerability to those external shocks can really hit consumers hard.
Precisely, the report suggests that India needs to focus on boosting domestic production of major oil seeds like sunflower and rapeseed and mustard.
Okay.
They also mention exploring the potential of those non-conventional oils like rice bran oil and corn oil.
So diversifying their sources of edible oils to become less reliant on imports, that sounds like a smart strategy.
Yeah.
Are there any other long-term challenges that the report flags?
Another challenge they highlight is that persistent deficit in pulses production.
Oh, the infamous pulse problem. It feels like lentils and beans are getting more expensive every time I shop.
Yeah, it's a significant issue, and it's driven by several factors,
Like what?
including limited production areas and that vulnerability to weather disruptions.
It makes sense.
The report suggests expanding the area under pulses cultivation and exploring options like summer cultivation in regions with good irrigation.
So increasing the overall supply to try to stabilize prices and ensure more consistent access for consumers.
Exactly. They also touch on the issue of vegetable price volatility, which we discussed earlier with that tomato price spike.
Right.
But it's not just tomatoes. Onions and potatoes can also see some pretty dramatic price swings.
And those swings can really throw a wrench in household budgets, especially for those families with limited incomes.
Absolutely. The report suggests improving storage and processing facilities for vegetables to help mitigate some of that volatility.
So if you can store and preserve those vegetables better,
Yeah.
you can kind of smooth out that supply chain and reduce those dramatic price spikes that impact both farmers and consumers.
Precisely now, beyond those commodity-specific challenges, the report highlights a broader issue, the need for better price monitoring and data collection.
Data, always a fascinating topic. Tell me more.
Well, in fiscal year 2024, The government took some really swift action to address price spikes in various items.
Okay.
And they were able to do this because they were closely monitoring prices at hundreds of centers across the country.
So they had a good grasp of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, but it sounds like there's room for improvement.
Ugh.
The report argues that even more granular data on prices at different stages of the supply chain would allow for even more effective intervention. They suggest linking that high-frequency price monitoring data collected by different government departments to get a clearer picture of how prices are evolving from the farm to the consumer.
So like creating this real-time dashboard for the entire agricultural and food supply chain.
Exactly.
You could spot potential problems early on
Yeah.
and take action before things spiral out of control.
Exactly. And they also recommend accelerating work on developing a producer price index for goods and services.
Okay.
This would provide a better understanding of what's called cost-push inflation, where rising production costs are ultimately driving up those prices for consumers.
Okay, so better data, more transparency, and a more comprehensive understanding of how prices are actually formed.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a key part of their long-term strategy for maintaining price stability. But is there anything else in the report that stands out to you?
There's one more significant point. The report mentions that the results of the latest household consumer expenditure survey are now available.
And what does that mean for the average person? How does this impact them directly?
Well, it means we might be on the verge of a major overhaul of the Consumer Price Index.
The CPI.
Yeah, the CPI. This is the index that tracks the prices at a basket of goods and services to measure inflation.
Right. It's how we measure the changes in the cost of living. It's that number we always hear about in the news.
Exactly. But the weights and item baskets used to calculate the CPI are based on older consumer expenditure data.
Right.
With this new survey data available, they can actually update the CPI to more accurately reflect current consumption patterns.
That's a crucial point. The way we measure inflation needs to keep up with the times, right?
Yeah.
You know, what people are buying today is probably quite different from what they were buying a decade or two ago.
Precisely by revising the CPI, they can get a more accurate and up-to-date picture of how inflation is actually impacting households across the country.
So it's not just about tweaking the numbers.
Right.
It's a potential shift in how we understand inflation in India.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring that the data reflects the reality of people's lives.
Right.
You know, the actual goods and services they're buying. Right.
And how much they're spending. It's about making sure that those policies designed to address inflation are based on a solid foundation of accurate and relevant information.
You know, it's easy to get lost in all the economic jargon, but this deep dive has really brought it home for me.
Yeah.
Inflation isn't just some abstract concept. It's the price of those tomatoes we talked about, the cost of cooking gas, the rent we pay.
Yeah.
It's about how far our hard-earned money can stretch.
Exactly. And what's particularly impressive about India's approach is that they're not just focused on controlling inflation in the short term.
Right.
They're also taking steps to address those long-term structural challenges that could impact prices down the line.
It's like they're thinking several moves ahead, like a chess grandmaster.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
They're thinking strategically about how to ensure price stability and economic resilience for the long haul.
So if we had to distill all this down for our listener, what are the key takeaways? What should they be paying attention to? Well, I think first and foremost, India's economy is showing real resilience in the face of some pretty significant global headwinds. That's the good news.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, inflation is complex. There are a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
It's influenced by global trends, domestic production, government policies, even the weather.
It's not just one thing going up or down.
Right.
It's a whole interconnected web of factors.
Exactly. So staying informed about both global and local economic trends is key. Keep an eye on those government policies, especially those related to food and energy prices.
Yeah.
Those are the things that will have the most direct impact on your wallet.
And you don't have to be an economist to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
Just start by paying attention to those everyday prices. You know, groceries, fuel, transportation.
Yeah.
How are they changing over time?
Absolutely. Become an informed consumer, understand the forces at play, and you'll be better equipped to navigate those economic ups and downs.
That's a great point to end on. I think we've covered a lot of ground on this deep dive.
We have.
But I think the biggest takeaway is that economics isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
No.
It's about the choices we make, the policies our leaders implement, and how those decisions ultimately impact our daily lives.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
We talked about the need for more granular data on prices to improve policymaking.
Right.
But imagine if we as consumers had access to that same level of detail, that real-time insight into how prices are formed
Yeah.
and what's driving those changes. How would that empower us to make more informed decisions about our spending, our investments, our overall economic well-being? That's something worth thinking about.
That's a fantastic question to leave our listeners with food for thought. Indeed, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into India's economic performance. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.